The Kingdom of Cambodia. The period Khmer Republic 1970 to 1975. While visiting Beijing in 1970, Sihanouk was ousted by a military coup led by Prime Minister Lon Non and Prince Chisawat Sirik Matak. U.S. support for the coup remains unproven. However, once the coup was completed, the new regime, which immediately demanded that the Vietnamese communists leave Cambodia, gained the political support of the United States. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, desperate to return their sanctuaries and supply lines from the North Vietnam, immediately launched armed attacks on the new government. The king urged his followers to help in overthrowing this government, hastening the onset of civil war. Soon Khmer Rouge rebels began using him to gain support. However, from 1970 until early 1972, the Cambodian conflict was largely one between the government and army of Cambodia and the armed forces of North Vietnam. As they gained control of Cambodian territory, the Vietnamese communists imposed a new political infrastructure, which was eventually dominated by the Cambodian communists, now referred to as the Khmer Rouge. Between 1969 and 1973, Republic of Vietnam and U.S. forces bombed Cambodia in an effort to disrupt the Viet Cong and Khmer Rouge. Documents uncovered from the Soviet archives after 1991 revealed that the North Vietnamese attempt to overrun Cambodia in 1970 was launched at the explicit request of the Khmer Rouge and negotiated by Pol Pot's then second-in-command Nun Chi. NVA units overran many Cambodian army positions, while the Communist Party of Cambodia expanded their small-scale attacks on lines of communication. In response to the North Vietnamese invasion, U.S. President Richard Nixon announced that U.S. and South Vietnamese ground forces had entered Cambodia in a campaign aimed at destroying NVA-based areas in Cambodia. Although a considerable quantity of equipment was seized or destroyed by U.S. and South Vietnamese forces, containment of North Vietnamese forces proved elusive. The Khmer Republic's leadership was lapsed by disunity among its three principal figures: Lon Non, Sihanouk's cousin Sirik Matak, and National Assembly leader in Tham. Lon Non remained in power in part because neither of the others was prepared to take his place. In 1972, a constitution was adopted, a parliament elected, and Lon Non became president. But disunity, the problems of transforming a 30,000-man army into a national combat force of more than 200,000 men, and spreading corruption weakened the civilian administration and army. The communist insurgency inside Cambodia continued to grow, aided by supplies and military support from the North Vietnam. Pol Pot and Ieng Sari asserted their dominance over the Vietnamese-run communists, many of whom were purged. At the same time, the CPK forces became stronger and more independent of their Vietnamese patrons. By 1973, the CPK were fighting battles against government forces with little or no Vietnamese North troop support, and they controlled nearly 60% of Cambodia's territory and 25% of its population. The government made three unsuccessful attempts to enter into negotiation with the insurrection, but by 1974 the CPK were operating openly as division, and some of the NVA combat forces and moved into South Vietnam. London's control was reduced to a small enclaves around the cities and main transportation routes. More than 2 million of refugees from the war live in Phnom Penh and other cities. On New Year's Day, 1975, Communist troops launched an offensive which 117 days of the hardest fighting the war led to the collapse of the Khmer Republic. Simultaneous attacks around the perimeter of Phnom Penh pinned down Republican forces, while other CPK units overran 5 bases controlling the vital lower Mekong resupply route. A U.S. funded a lift of ammunition and rising it when the Congress refused additional aid for Cambodia. The London government in Phnom Penh surrendered on 17 April 1975, just 5 days after the U.S. mission evacuated Cambodia. Khmer regime 1975 to 1978. The Khmer reached Phnom Penh and took power in 1975. Led by Pol Pot, they changed the official name of the country to Democratic Cambodia. The new regime modeled itself on Mount East China during the Great Leap Forward, immediately evacuating the cities and sent the entire population on forced march to rural work protests. They attempted to rebuild the country's agriculture on the model of the 11th century, discarded Western medicine, and destroyed temples, libraries, and anything considered Western. Estimates as to know to how many people were killed by the Khmer regime range from the approximately 1 to 3 million. The most commonly cited figure is 2 million, about a quarter of the population. This era gave rise to the term killing fields, and the prison Tuol Sang became notorious for its history of mass killing. Hundreds of thousands fled across the border into neighboring Thailand. The regime disproportionately targeted ethnic minority groups. The Cham Muslims suffered serious purges as much as half of their population exterminated. Pol Pot was determined to keep his power and disenfranchise any enemies or potential threats, and thus increase his violent and aggressive action against his people. Forestry pageant in 1970 and thus during the Khmer Rouge era reduced the Vietnamese population in Cambodia from between 250,000 and 300,000 in 1969 to a reported 56,000 in 1984. However, most of the victims of the Khmer Rouge regime were not ethnic minorities but ethnic Khmer. Professionals such as doctors, lawyers, and teachers were also targeted. According to Robert T. Kaplan, eyeglasses were as deadly as a yellow star, as they were seen as a sign of intellectualism. Religious institutions were targeted by the Khmer Rouge particularly fiercely. Religions were so viciously persecuted to such a terrifying extent that the vast majority of Cambodia's historic architecture, 95% of Cambodia's Buddhist temples, was completely destroyed.